Hey there, everybody. Those of you who have been with us for a while know that we do some pretty intensive hot composting using garden scraps, kitchen waste, the bedding from the ducklings, and a whole mess of wood chips and biochar. For those of you who haven't been with us as long, consider that your introduction. I would say that we are in agreement with David the Good when it comes to the idea that you can compost everything. But there is a difference, both a qualitative difference and an operational difference between a hot compost system and a cold compost system, and the streamlining of those two approaches in regards to the gardens that you are using it in seems like a good idea. So let's take a look at the other way that we are composting. We're now down in the woods. You can see the main tractor path off to the right and the footpath leading up to the back of the bird yard here to the left. And you'll notice right off the bat a distinct difference in color between these two sets of wood chips here, the path and the one that is the erstwhile garden bed in progress. And into this space we have thrown leaf-rich wood chip, some biochar as we make it, rabbit bedding and rabbit wastes in here. Some are under the chip, some are over the chip. This pile of rabbit waste here is approximately 2 weeks worth of their leavings, and it's not too bad. If we had more, I figure I could probably cover more of this, but the effort to output ratio is, in my view, good where it is at the moment. But so, in the woods, in our food forest, in a forest, the consideration is really for the efficacy of each deposition. And to my mind, there are a few key differences in the approach that should be taken in a slow-moving wooded environment as opposed to a fast-moving, high-intensity annual production environment. And so in the woods, what we are opting for is a cold compost slow breakdown. While this is a large mass of chips and leaves that would compost were it consolidated into one pile, as it is sitting in this windrow, there is not enough mass for it to heat to what would be operating kill-off pathogens temperatures between 160 and 175. And so in these spaces, the slower nature of the garden is synchronous with the slow nature of this compost process. Come fall, when the leaves start falling again, we'll do the same thing that we did last year, which was clean up the pathways and bring all of that leafy material, all of that micronutrient and mineral fertility into these spaces again to cover them again. And the idea is that with the additional wood chip here, the runoff through the sandy parent material will be minimal in these spaces, and the wood chip should hold on to a lot more of that mineral fertility that we're looking for as we define these spaces. And some of you might be wondering, how do you come to that decision? What did you measure? What did you observe that caused you to pick these types of roots. And I think part of that is drawn from my experience doing things like operating in commercial spaces as logistics coordinator, or just being interested in general efficiency studies. Richard Perkins has talked a lot about movement studies in production agriculture, and that is sort of a process by which you figure out what the key actions are and how many movements it takes to perform the action. And the idea is to streamline that process through iterations to make it so that the amount of times you have to move to perform the action is decreased over time to the point where it's so efficient that you almost don't have to move. You can see an application of something like that in, say, like a raised keyhole garden, where you don't have to move. You can harvest from left, right, and center without having to do much more than shift a little. And so things like that have definitely played into the way that we are approaching these projects. Part of the struggle, really, is that no matter what I am doing, unless I am devoting a lot of my time to the act of composting and the turning of it and the production of it and the sourcing of new material, I will not have enough at any given time to do a thorough dressing of these beds. There is a lot of space back here, and if I wanted to put active, rich, hot composted material down, I would have to purchase in a large portion of it. And while that's an option, it's not really the method that we are opting to take, because the idea of ethical moving of that kind of material using petromiles to move fertility from one huge place to another over long distances is it's not in line with our project's ethics and goals. And this is all about what we can do for the least amount of money and in a replenishable or regenerative way that reduces our overall footprint. And so there is the consideration of the cost of the compost. There's also the consideration of the parent materials. There have been a few news articles lately that have talked about several large-scale compost producers having to do recalls or having customers and clients lose entire crops due to the presence of persistent herbicides from hay fields and feedstock for animals, or deworming treatments from large livestock like sheep, horses, cows, and the like. And those can remain in the soil and impact predominantly, in my understanding, the broadleaf plants rather than the grasses. And so the worry, I guess, in my mind is, what would that commercially processed compost contain? And would it damage the system that I am literally pouring blood, sweat, and tears into? How would that affect it? How long would the timeline be for recovery if that were to occur? And the calculus for us insists that that approach is not a viable one for us. Your considerations may differ. You may be starting with a truly desolate place, but I think that, and this is purely opinion, I think that cold calling your local arborists and tree crews finding lawn care companies that don't use chemicals and refuse to work on properties that have been recently sprayed, such as ones that I used to work on, might be an avenue for you that is longer term, more sustainable for the project of yours. And the other consideration, at least on our site, is that we have our main access to the woods up that way. And so while our paths are laid out in a function where I can come in with material from either side of the property, and that would be the south side that way, which means north is behind us. I can come in from the north or south and deposit materials, but the travel time for that, going back to those motion studies, precludes that from being a constant option. We'll still come in with parent materials that I feel are woodlot or forest appropriate. And that's things like herbivorous manures like the rabbits, migratory bird manures, which I consider the Muscovies bedding to be functionally similar to. They eat a wide variety of things, and so their manures are filled with a myriad of nutrients that are not coming in otherwise. And the wood chip and carbon that we get from the tree crews that we have so far set up relationships with. The wood chips I am willing to make more trips up and down this path with, because they are the underpinning of the future efficacy of this project. And so it seems worthwhile, but to be pulling all of the hot compost down into these spaces feels counterintuitive. I would rather use that high intensity compost for high intensity gardens up top, and where this will all be slower growing and slower acclimating plants, things that will take years to mature, and every so often push of fertility feels like the appropriate approach for a system like this. There are also those considerations from forest ecosystem biologists and folks who study the ecology of forests, and in talking to some of them, it's apparent that there are possible introductions of non-supportive species. I don't want to say that they're necessarily blanket detrimental, because I'm a permaculturist on the internet, everything is context. So there is the potential for displacement of functionally more appropriate species if we were to introduce non-native worms or things that are more prone to being in grassy areas or in high production annual crops. And if we are putting those creatures into the soil of our forests, there is the potential for negative interactions. And so I am familiar with some people that do hot composting bins or bays or setups in their woods or just inside the wood line. And I think that for those people that choose to do that, there are efficacy considerations that we can go into. So let's talk about those a little bit. We are back up top looking at the composting situations, and you'll notice back here, that little pallet right in between these two uprights, that is the back door for the bird yard. And what that allows me to do is more efficiently move the finished materials from here down and out towards the pathway we were just coming up, so that if I do choose to deposit the hot compost, the more intensively produced compost, I have an easier, gravitationally enhanced, let's call it, method of dispersal. And so placing your compost systems in intermediate spaces by the transition from field to forest is certainly the way that I would recommend doing it. No matter what your context is, finding a space that is higher in the landscape to do two things. One is the ease of moving weighty material downhill and then coming back uphill empty. That'll save you effort and energy to allow you to more efficiently and quickly spread your compost. The other is that in these interchanges, there's very often in New England a transitional slope. And so by positioning these midway between the high point of the system and the low point of the system, we're doing two things. One, we can position these so as to catch water as like a berm or just a blockage, think like a weir for the water that is about to move down slope. What that'll do is that'll hydrate your compost and it will partially leach nutrient into the surrounding subsoil, which is then moved by the subsoil community. And the other part of it is that it'll be less ornery. It'll be a less harsh process to move that to equivalent height spaces. So we have some compost close to the top of the space that we occupy on our site. We have some placed in the middle, and then down in the very back on that northwest corner of the property that we've been at recently, we have another small collection of trimmings and things that I am collecting from the boundaries of the property so that we can create those water catchment structures, hydrate and fertilize at the same time, but in a method similar to the piles that are back down there. I'm sure that if I spent time collecting it up into a sizable mound like one of these, it would really start cooking away, and that is okay. But in order to keep it going, I might have to turn it or produce enough mass to have it cook down on its own, and building more structure like that in the woods when I find that windrows and open piles are the best for the birds that we use for turning is not really the method that I think is going to be the best for us. So I hope that this is helpful to you folks. I'm wondering what your compost considerations are in your systems. What do you think your ideal compost flow looks like? What do you use your compost for? Are you doing multiple composting setups in such a way as to capture the energy most efficiently used? Or are there other considerations you are using for your decisions? I'd be very interested to know. The ducks really enjoy the potato chips, by the way. They're a lot of fun to watch. So, these are my thoughts. This is our process, and I'd love to hear from you folks. But, till next time, thanks for watching. Happy planting.